HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Deer Grow.
Man, it's almost food plot season, Jared, and Deer Grow is one of those products that has really changed the way that we plant food plots and the success we've seen from them.
No doubt. I've been, trying to plant food plots my entire whitetail hunting career, which is a little shorter than yours. But the minute that I started, or that I realized that I could get Deer Grow back into some of these remote plots where I couldn't get lime or fertilizer, especially in the 50-pound bag, format. Mm-hmm. So everything was changed. I could get into these spots moving forward with a backpack sprayer, and that's since escalated to these 40 or 60 gallon sprayers, and we're doing upwards of 5 to 10 acre food plots just with Deer Grow and having phenomenal success.
Yeah, and with the price of fertilizer, lime, diesel, everything this year, what better way to get in there and grow a successful food plot at about a third of the cost? Check out Deer Grow at deergrow.com. And we're back.
Hey,
HUNTR Podcast 115, as Nick so eloquently put.
Thanks, Nick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Nick, how them lips holding up this time of year, man?
How's
dry for you?
The lips?
Yeah.
Straight chapped.
Yeah, I don't know. I have a thing though where I don't really like using chapstick.
Really?
It's a texture thing.
Interesting. Explain that to me. The texture thing.
Like chapstick and lotion, I just stay away from.
Interesting.
You use lotion?
It's like a phobia thing.
There's a chance that you'll dry out one day.
I might. All I do is drink coffee. I'm turned into a raisin.
Yeah. I share the dislike. I don't like chapstick either, because I've always been a believer if you drink enough water, shouldn't eat it. But mine's pretty dry. Feeling pretty dry.
Yeah. This time of the year just sucks. At least here, I don't know about most states are not like where we're at, but we are in a cloud of gray 90% of the time.
We've had some sun. Yesterday was nice.
I know. Well, so
you're just in here all the time.
Yeah. So I went to the doctor the other day, and I'm super deficient in vitamin D. Yeah. Basically doesn't exist. And so I was like, well, that seems
normal. You don't take vitamin D? You don't supplement?
I have a daily vitamin, but now I'm taking also vitamin D on top of that.
Yeah. And
she was like, 90% of the adults in Pennsylvania are vitamin D deficient.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I had no idea.
It'd be like the Liver King.
Apparently it's pretty important.
Yeah, I believe it.
That was the Liver King method. He just gets his bare butthole facing the sun. That's just the best way to take in vitamin D.
Yeah.
Have you seen he's going natty now? He's
he's so full of shit.
Well, that's his claim, is he's documenting his transition to natty.
He's gonna look like Nixon.
Nick, I'm 210 and holding.
Damn.
Solid 210.
Yeah, you're going 3 or 4 pounds a week.
Well, I gained it on vacation, and I'm just keeping it, converting it back to muscle. It was Corona, and then it was fat, and now it's muscle.
Nice.
I hope.
Is that the heaviest you've ever weighed?
No, I was 215 my senior year in high school.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to blow it out of the water this summer.
Where do you think you're going? 220s?
A solid 215 would
be a linebacker.
Well, because what will happen is, as we start thinking Dakotas and mule deer, I'll get that pack on my back.
Cardioing it down.
It's hard to hold weight when I'm doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that'll do it. Although our Dakota plans kind of took a small twist here.
Yeah.
So we're still kind of figuring out. We're going to put in for North Dakota draw.
We got to hunt muleys.
See what happens.
We got to figure it out.
I know, and they've gotten rain. They've gotten decent snow in that area. They're spot on again. So
there's an over-the-counter Colorado tag.
Yeah.
We got options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that September time frame gets tight, though, on us pretty quick every year.
Well, I'm not options scheduling-wise, but options state-wise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we got to be out there for velvet.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
I was stoked to hear it the other day when I texted you. I was like, Jeremy's got this Kentucky farm. He's going to be a little...
No, I'm open for it.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, now... because I would love to be there hunting velvet, but, we'll see what happens whole season. So, it is the 20th. You're listening to this, it's the 21st, because Nick turned it around really fast again.
Thanks, Nick.
Mm-hmm. We have a guest today. So we've got Dr. Bronson Strickland back on from good old Mississippi State Deer Lab. We've kind of covered a bunch of different deer topics with Bronson over the last year and a half, I would say. And so they're working on some new projects. They've got some new grant money. And so one of the topics that I think we haven't talked about a lot yet that we probably need to is chronic wasting disease, CWD. And I think one of the reasons that we want to talk about it with Bronson is, number one, he's a deer biologist, professor, understands the anatomy and how this all kind of factors in with management strategies. But also, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there and probably a lot of, I don't know if you would call it criticism with state agencies, but confusion maybe in terms of, not even just what is CWD, but like how is it truly affecting my hunting or my deer populations on my property, if at all. And I think that's probably where most of the discussions usually go quickly is, how is this affecting me? Like on a landscape level, I get it, but like on my farm, like we don't have any CWD here yet. I'm in a CWD zone and now my regulations have all changed. And we hear this a lot, especially if you're in the western part of Wisconsin, particularly in kind of that river belt with Buffalo County. There's some big changes about to happen up there because of recently found CWD.
Coshocton was the other one that came to mind. I know. So in Ben's area in Ohio, I think they banned baiting for a period of time, having to do with some CWD occurrences. But dude, personally, I'm in that demographic of people that I don't really know a lot about it. Like I know that it has to or has had to do with like deer farming, is like how a lot of it has like transporting deer from state to state and but as far as like impacting me directly, I can't say that it has or that I am aware of it.
So I think what we'll get in with Bronson today is the factors of most of the time we're dealing with it on a restricted area basis. However, the ability for this thing to expand on a landscape level, I mean, go from a couple farms or a couple counties to statewide, is why most DNRs or game commissions or whoever take this so serious. Because, unlike EHD, CWD is always fatal. Like that deer will die. Maybe it's not next month, maybe it's 2 years from now, but that deer will die, period. And so, we'll probably get in a little bit with him, the discussions around EHD versus CWD, because a lot of the people who are critical of CWD will say, well, EHD is way worse. From a spatial time standpoint, temporal standpoint of like, hey, here it is, it just happened, these deer died. Yeah, EHD probably is or perceives to be a lot worse. From a long-term standpoint, not so much because of what CWD can do on a landscape level over the course of time. And so that's where I think some of the misunderstandings come into play is like, well, I've seen 20 deer die from EHD. I've walked the farm. There they are. I've never seen a deer dead from CWD, or at least not that you know of.
And so I assume it's tougher to identify, right? Because like EHD is typically right in that September time frame. They're going to have just shed out of velvet. They're going to be in water. A lot of easier ways to determine that versus, most deer that are CWD positive are discovered in hunter harvested deer, meaning they were alive, they got shot, then they were tested, they had CWD. So that's what we'll get in with Bronson today, is to kind of discuss some of those, maybe discussion points that the general public is a little bit fuzzy on, in terms of, most of the deer that they hear being tested or testing positive from CWD happen to be deer that were killed by hunters, not on the other side, EHD, which are being found dead in, mass water graves or whatever it might be. Yeah, interesting.
So, want to bring Bronson in?
Let's do it.
Okay.
It's my line, Nick. Let's do it.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are y'all?
Good. How bad did I butcher that intro?
Or you said we were muted next, so he couldn't hear us?
He couldn't hear us.
I didn't hear it.
Oh, he couldn't hear us.
Nah.
I was going to say, wait a minute.
Bummer.
Normally they can hear and see us.
Gonna have lots of
yeah. Well,
Correct.
perfect. It's you're gonna go into this thing blind, Bronson.
So I'm always worried when I can't hear.
And go. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, what's your take on that observation? No,
Well,
so
I always feel like you might be saying, and today we have this crackpot from Mississippi joining us today. So,
You won't
never.
know until it drops. anyways.
Never. Yeah. No, it was actually a pretty detailed breakdown. So, first of all, thanks for coming on the podcast. We appreciate you
bet.
spending your President's Day with us.
I think Bronson has been with us more than anybody else.
How about
Is
that?
this your third time on the podcast?
I believe so.
Third
Yeah.
time's a charm.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
We'll send you a medal.
One of the things that we kind of touched on in the beginning here, Bronson, is when we talk about chronic wasting disease, most of the time, I would say that the general hunting public is very confused and or misinterpreting, everything around CWD from the point of what the DNR is doing to even how CWD affects deer. And kind of what Jared and I were discussing here in the beginning, which you couldn't hear, but is that, oftentimes it gets, put up against things like EHD, which in a time standpoint of I just found 15 deer dead because of EHD seems practically more lethal to deer than chronic wasting disease.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's I think that's a great lead in there. I think the primary difference between, say, EHD and chronic wasting disease is in the name of the disease, and that is chronic. Chronic meaning very subtle, chronic meaning insidious, chronic meaning that it takes a whole bunch of time for the disease to manifest to such a degree that there's going to be a tangible, noticeable change in the deer population. People can really buy in to EHD because they see it firsthand.
Mm-hmm.
They see it this year. They see the carcasses right now. And it's very different with chronic wasting disease. So we never, I guess anybody that hopefully is explaining it well is when CWD is found, nobody that understands a disease is going to say, and you're going to see changes next year.
Mm-hmm.
I would even go so far as to say you probably have 10 or more years before there will be any discernible, noticeable changes.
Mm-hmm.
And think about how it typically happens is the disease is discovered, and it might be at that point a prevalence rate of 1% or 5% or less. Well, then, of that 5%, let's say the prevalence rate you detected is accurate, those deer may still live for a year to up to 2 years before their demise. And so if you have a very low prevalence rate and they're living for a year or two with the disease, you would not reasonably expect to see any changes in the deer population. Now, let's have a Midwestern context where EHD, you have that wave that comes through, and 30%, 40%, sometimes people are claiming, 2/3 of the deer died. Well, oh my God, yeah, you had an immediate effect on that deer population. The difference is with EHD, it's a virus, and the next year the population begins building
Mm-hmm.
and building, and then finally you can recover. And depending on the population dynamics and the productivity of the herd, it may be 2 years later, it may be 5 years later, but the deer herd recovers. When you reach that tipping point with CWD, I don't know if you can ever recover. And the word we use is it becomes endemic, meaning now there's environmental spread going on with the population. And it's really too early for me to sit here and say you'll never recover from it. I don't know that because we haven't been far enough down that road to determine it. But we certainly have what I think is very credible evidence from places that have been dealing with it for decades. And then the response after you reach a sufficient level and now you start doing studies, and unfortunately research takes time. And so then you might have a decade later, up to 2 decades later, Wyoming is a great example, where they are doing their studies and looking at their population dynamics and marking deer, looking at cause-specific mortality, survival, etc. And yeah, they are detecting a population decline. But it's not like an EHD decline.
Sure.
It's not we lost 30% of our deer herd. It's this slow year by year, decline in the deer herd. And that, because we are human beings, that is difficult for us to reconcile and assess. We're just so used to, what is the problem? We're going to deal with it right now. We better see a change next year. And that's just not the way to manage CWD. You're not going to have answers or solutions that quickly.
Can you tell us a little bit about CWD? I guess more for me and our listeners. Like, what is CWD? Maybe where did it come from? How does it spread? And how does it ultimately claim its victims?
Well, Jared, you were in luck, my friend. We just released on our YouTube channel, we've got about 10 videos that we call narrated infomercials that basically go through topic by topic and explain this.
Okay.
And very, we hope, very easy to understand terminology and so forth. CWD is the deer equivalent of mad cow disease. And so this is a prion based, and man, that is really complicated. So prions are not viruses, they're not bacteria. It is essentially a rogue protein. And with mad cow disease, it was able to be managed. Unfortunately, when they discovered it, and humans were consuming infected meat, and there's a bunch of strong evidence saying that led to the unfortunate demise of a couple hundred people. But we don't. So the good thing about CWD at this point is we haven't established a linkage between consuming infected venison and prion associated diseases with humans. So, and hopefully it stays that way. The difference with mad cow disease was that cows were essentially infecting themselves by the way that food was managed for cows. So in the animal production system decades ago, is that once you collected the meat that went into the human consumption food system, the remains of livestock would then be rendered down, bone, inedible tissues, etc. Well, cows, like probably most vertebrates, suffer from this prion disease, their version of the prion disease. Brain tissue and central nervous system tissue would then be rendered down, put back into feed to boost the protein levels, and then that was distributed to cows. Cows would consume that. Within that feed were infectious prions that came from previously slaughtered cows. That is what kept that infection system going. The good thing, if there is anything good about mad cow disease, is there was no animal to animal infection. And to me, that makes all the difference in the world. So one cow in your pasture could be infected with mad cow disease. It was not spreading it to its offspring or to another cow in the pasture. And so once you took the prions out of the feed that was going to these cows, you essentially eliminated the disease cycle. That was how they were effectively able to do that. Unfortunately for deer and for sheep, they become infectious. And so they start shedding these prions in their saliva. They shed it in their urine, feces, etc. But it is most concentrated in their saliva. And so that when you have inter-animal or animal-to-animal contact, that is how they are spreading it. And so that's really a huge difference.
Do they know the primary reason for that? I mean, that's a pretty massive, it's basically contagious versus not contagious. It's not that hard to not eat cow brains. It's pretty hard to not eat the same thing other deer are eating.
Right. I'm sure a prion researcher knows that, but I don't, and I have no way to articulate that.
What is a prion?
It is essentially that's a more complicated question than you might realize. Everybody essentially has, if you're a vertebrate, if you have a spinal cord, a backbone, you have what are called prions. Prions communicate information between your brain and your limbs, your tissues through your central nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
For whatever reason, this protein becomes, first of all, it becomes misfolded. And when it becomes misfolded, it is not able to be assimilated in their tissue. The cell that it's encapsulated in is not able to die. And so it becomes this structure that cannot be eliminated from the central nervous system. Now, the infectious part of it is, again, it's not a virus, it's not a bacteria, but when an infectious prion essentially is adjacent to a normal prion, it also causes the normal prion to become misfolded and now non-functional.
Is it misfolded? Am I saying that right?
Yeah. Misfolded is the word we use, and it's just so that the structure of it becomes non-functional, the way a functional prion would be, and then it causes its neighbor to become non-functional, misfolded as well, and then that accumulates and that accumulates. Ultimately, the name of these diseases, the acronym is TSE, transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. And that essentially means transmit from, structure to structure, animal to animal. Spongiform, that part means spongiform in your brain. That means that eventually you're going to have holes in your brain. And so that's where that comes from. So ultimately what happens to the deer, and it's not immediate. It takes months and months and months for this to happen. But when they become clinical, and you see these sad stories of the zombie deer stumbling along, it essentially has holes in its brain, and its central nervous system is not working anymore, and then death is inevitable at that point. So that's what differs. So you can make, I guess, an analog of EHD. Here you go. Here's another sensitivity for a lot of people. It shouldn't be because it's biology, but EHD is like COVID in terms of it is a virus. You get the virus, you have an immune system response, and your immune system is either going to overwhelm the virus and take care of it, deactivate it, so to speak, or the virus is going to overwhelm you and you're going to die. Within EHD, there are two forms of that, and the two forms are the acute form and the chronic form. And then there's probably also some deer that don't even suffer from chronic, just like with COVID. You get it, you got a headache for a day, you're done with it, you process the virus. The acute form is that a deer gets EHD and 3 days later it's dead. The virus overwhelms it. It gets a temperature. It goes to a pond, a creek, some water source. It lays down, and what's going on there is it's got a temperature. The deer is trying to cool itself, and then sometimes the deer never makes it out of the water. Right. It dies. The chronic form, and Jeremy, you remember when we're looking at harvest data, one of the metrics we use is hoof sloughing.
Yep.
And hoof sloughing is just an indicator that, and in the South, this is really, really common. EHD came through. Most of the deer reconciled the virus okay. Yep. As a consequence, though, their hooves slough because while they had this temperature and they're mending their bodies and dealing with this virus, their hooves stop growing. Growth is interrupted. And so you'll see a very distinct breakage essentially in their fingernails from that. And then the hoof starts growing again. And so it's just something you can monitor from year to year.
Yeah, it's a clinical thing that you can associate with. A lot of people, when, the common hunter would call it like slipper foot or something, where, it looks like, an elf shoe basically, or whatever you want to call it. And Bronson, I think that where a lot of people have a tough time is, and you just kind of nailed on it there, in the South, these deer, for whatever reason, maybe it's because of the year-to-year thing. We talk about the antibodies that potentially the doe passes on to her offspring, but you don't see as many cases of acute form of EHD in the South as you do in the Midwest and Northeast. I mean, when we have EHD outbreaks in the Midwest and Northeast, we're talking, and on a spatial standpoint, right, on a very isolated geography standpoint, significant herd reductions, because it's just not common or hasn't been common in those herds.
Right. That's exactly right. So antibodies.
Yep.
It's you have when the virus sweeps through, and in the South we essentially deal with it at some level every single year.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not qualified to say this, so I may be wrong, but I would venture that every state in the South, you're going to have some level of mortality every single year.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not noticeable. It may be less than 1%, but the whole deal with that is the virus is more or less endemic within those populations. Those mothers have dealt with and reconciled the virus, and they pass those antibodies on to their offspring. It becomes novel in the Midwest or further north, and so you haven't built up the immunity to it, and so that virus comes through. And that's where you have these outbreaks, and a significant proportion of your deer die from it. If you were to take those same deer herds in the Midwest, confront them with the virus every single year, they would have the same type of immune response we would in the South.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's where, and again, obviously, relatively newly discovered in the South being CWD, but if you look in the Midwest and the Northeast, most of these states have been dealing with CWD for more than a decade, I would say, and a lot of them.
In some places 2 decades.
Yeah, and so I think it's almost like the flip flop of it. But the first one I can remember was, I want to say 2012, when I was in Missouri. We had a massive acute EHD outbreak, to the point where, I was finding opening day of bow season, which was mid-September there, I could smell rotting deer in the creeks and stuff. And that was very new to us. Now, at the same time, northern Missouri was already dealing with CWD. And so it's kind of a weird thing when you see that flop of, again, so many deer hunters are saying, look at all these deer dead in the creek. Like, how is this not worse than what we're potentially putting thousands and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars into CWD? And I think, again, it's that, I don't want to say necessarily lack of understanding, but to a point it is, where those waves in that short, spatial and temporal restrictions of, EHD exist, the possible detriment of a CWD is much greater. Where I think people kind of maybe fall behind, and I don't know how you want to elaborate on this, Bronson, is that oftentimes I think that when they hear the plan or the strategy from, let's say, the DNR, Department of Conservation, or Game Commission, whoever it is, it seems so extreme, considering most people listening to this would say the only time I hear of a deer dying from chronic wasting is because a hunter shot it and then it tested positive, right? It didn't literally die from chronic wasting. The hunter shot it, it was tested, it tested positive. Versus on the EHD side, these deer are dead. Like, I see them, they're everywhere. And so now when you hear plans coming into play of, sharpshooter programs, very liberal bag limits and extra tags for areas of CWD, quickly these people are saying, how are we going to allow this, extreme measures of deer removal where it doesn't seem like that CWD is actually killing deer in the area?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there with people's responses, and I guess we have to think of short-term and long-term.
Right.
And, being a biologist and understanding the long-term consequences, and the long-term consequences are far more detrimental, even though it may be 2 decades away. But when you understand what is in the future, if you don't redirect and do something now that may seem very drastic in the short term, but knowing that best we can tell, this is better off for the deer herd and the population dynamics and hunters for the long term, that is a tough pill to swallow.
Can I backtrack a little bit? So like before you get to explaining whatever's been put forth to what can be done with CWD. So I mean, I assume that's what's gonna prompt whatever you're talking about, these prescriptions that frankly I'm not aware of. But so basically what we know from you today, Bronson, is that CWD ultimately, first of all, you said in the intro, it kills 100% of the deer.
It's always fatal.
It's always fatal. And it's chronic, so it's long term, so deer can hold it for long term, and it's also transmissible. So like what can be done? What hope is there to mitigate it in any way? Because that's going to be a polar opposite answer probably to EHD, because what was anything ever done? It's just basically they adapted and overcame, which sounds like, and
it's not usually a long-term thing. Like it happens and it's gone.
That seems like the difference that I'm understanding is that because some, or a demographic of deer survived from EHD, they were able to adapt and overcome. Whereas with CWD, 100% of them die at some point in time. How did they ever overcome that? It seems like they couldn't. So,
yeah. Well, Jared, that's a really good question, and that's why it is so difficult. There really aren't good solutions in the long term, especially once the disease becomes endemic. There's really very little you can do. That's why there's so much emphasis on testing, and once if you can locate it, identify it early, at least you have a few options. Once you start getting in the situation where we found it and there's a 30, 40, 50% prevalence rate, your options are pretty much eliminated.
Because it's basically kill all the deer that have it, right? It's basically all that we have.
Currently. That's really, and that's probably not going to be a good solution either, but because at that level, killing all the existing deer, it's probably still going to be environmental and continue to be spread. If that makes sense.
When you say environmental, meaning that actually it will transfer to, plants and food sources that the deer are eating. Like it's not just the deer themselves, but it's actually out there in the environment.
Yeah, so that's something, in my opinion, and again, you really need to ask a prion researcher, which there are plenty of them that really understand this far better. It gets way over my head, the complexity of it. But take, for example, in Colorado, which is where the whole CWD, the name was first coined, was out there. And so they had pastures where, something unusual happened. There's this disease that is killing these deer, and you eliminate all the deer. And then you go in and, quote, disinfect the pasture as best you can and let it sit idle for years. I think it was 3 to 4 years. No deer were in this confined space. And you bring deer and put them back in there. Same with scrapie. You bring sheep and put them back in there, and what do you know? We either have scrapie again or CWD again. So somehow in the environment, soil, plants, there is some way those prions are existing and being consumed and taken up again. And Jared, there's something I want to be careful here. I always try to distinguish what is possible with the laboratory and what is probable in the wild. And we know from our experience with COVID, there's a big difference of what is possible and what is the likely mode of transmission, et cetera. So it has been demonstrated in a laboratory where infectious prion can be put in a soil, and that prion or prions be taken up via the roots and then found in the plant tissue of a plant growing in that soil. Now, to my knowledge, no one has demonstrated that is a viable mode of transmission. It's just one of those many ways we're exploring right now of, hey, there are prions in the plant tissue of a plant that a deer may consume, and that may be, a pathway for transmission. Here's another one that we just recently found, and a student has presented it and will present it at the deer study group in a few weeks. Look at licking branches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
that's
you got a scrape
saliva.
system. There's saliva where the concentration is greatest. So we were able to collect licking branches and then the soil at scrapes and be able to identify prions there. And so there we have another mechanism for detection. So a place where you may not be able to
there's all
harvest deer,
all
or
kind
hunters aren't.
all kind of stuff. I think of all the places that deer come together and their, saliva is getting on the same stuff: licking branches, salt blocks, corn piles, you name it,
Right.
all kinds of stuff, food plots, even just out in the woods. I mean, there's
Well, and that's I think from a hunter standpoint, I mean, obviously that makes sense. I don't know how many states are up to it now, but you mentioned earlier the prions in deer urine, and now you see all these urine ban states. Virginia, I know, was one. I'm not sure who else is now on that same bucket list, but I mean,
it's getting distributed that way.
Well, yeah. So to the point where
Right.
these companies like Tink 69 and like the synthetic stuff, right? But no natural deer urine's allowed to be used anymore. Which
right.
I don't know. To your point again, going back to those transmissible ways. I mean, have we demonstrated in the wild or in cases that it can be transmitted via the deer urine aspect of things?
Not to my knowledge.
Right.
Not to my knowledge.
Again, more proactive. I would say those, banning.
I'm sure it could, though. Well, I mean, if you're putting a pea on the ground and then in a laboratory, at least they're saying it can be absorbed and then growing up. If you can prove that in a laboratory, that seems like a relatively easy thing to prove. It's just like, why would you? You're gonna.
Well, that's why I'm saying it's more proactive of a ban than it is like, hey, let's let this happen for a while until we actually can discover it, and then it's buck wild at that point. No pun intended.
Yeah.
Well, one thing, and I am speaking out of turn here, and an immunologist or some epidemiologist who probably might laugh at this, but from what I understand from people that understand this far better than me, that there is likely a threshold effect. And again, I'm going to keep making these COVID comparisons just because that's in our nomenclature right now. It's our life. I remember experts saying that, sometimes it's about viral load with transmission, and that if you're getting a single virus particle, it may not be enough. Your immune system can just jump on top of it and whip it, and no problem at all. But it's that when you reach that tipping point of you got a big dose of it all at once, then that started the cascading effect of the disease process. I have heard the same thing from people that know a lot more about prions than me. And so I think that might be where some of the arguments come from, is if the level of prions is really, really low in urine, is there going to be a sufficient amount that would cause infection?
Yeah.
Versus a one-to-one saliva, transmission. We know that that's a viable form. And I think that's going to be the biggest breakthrough years down the road, if it can be done. It is identifying those sensitivities. If you got to look at the whole life history and life cycle of deer, and where are those places in their life cycle where here is where transmission is occurring. It's occurring a little bit at all these other places, but 50% of the transmission is occurring here. And then you got to look at it and go, can we do anything to disrupt that part of the transmission? Then we may have a solution. But right now, to my knowledge, we don't know all the ways. We know all the possibilities of the ways it can be transmitted. And so, we're trying to address every single one of those. And when you look at, I know from that great Wyoming paper that came out several years ago, and there, Jeremy, in our scientific articles, we always end up with conclusions or management recommendations, management implications, which is essentially what can you do with the information we provided. The best information they provided was, don't get it.
Yeah.
Once you got it, you got it. You're going to be dealing with it probably the rest of your life. So don't get it.
Yeah.
And so when you look at, for examples like urine ban, it's like, we're going to try to be as proactive as we can, do everything just to keep it out of our state.
Yeah, and I think that's where, from a general public standpoint, like I'm sure people listening to this are pissy about the fact that, whatever, natural deer urines are banned and stuff. But, I would say
Pun
most
intended, I saw there.
Yeah, right. Most of, actually I didn't, but that would have been a good one if I claimed it. I think most people are probably more upset around the inability to get proper communication from a lot of the state agencies in terms of these mitigation efforts. Right. So when these things happen,
which are what? Rattle some of those off.
So I mean,
because basically what I'm understanding here is we don't know anything that's gonna. We're basically just trying to slow the spread.
We're trying to proactively
so we can figure out how to,
yeah,
either cure it or cleanse the environment that it's.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the cure thing here in a second. But so what I think is hard from my aspect as, let's say, a biologist, Bronson, is that it seems like every state does it differently, right? And I get it to a point, because every state's hunting and populations and density of hunters in an area are different. But ultimately, every state should be learning from the past to things that did work and didn't work. So I'll lay out, just because it's the one I'm most familiar with, was the efforts done in northern Missouri. So this was kind of traced back to a high fence facility escapee. And we'll talk about maybe movement here in a second, but fugitive. Yeah. And so
happens a lot, apparently.
Yeah. Oh, very, very high.
I told you another deer got out in Bryan's area.
No.
Again this year.
Yeah. And see, there's
like all the time, these people's pet deer and stuff are getting out.
This in lies the issue of high fences versus the actual resource, but we won't dive into that. So anyways, northern Missouri, apparently leak from a high fence into the wild. And I don't know where prevalency rates were at that point, Bronson, but I mean, it became a very quick to identify, hey, we need to do something here. And so most
from one deer,
potentially, we don't know.
Okay.
But I mean, it definitely began to affect. So what happened was, during the hunter harvest test, there were wild deer that were testing positive for CWD. So the Missouri Department of Conservation starts to enact plans. One of the first ones that they did was basically, call it mass harvest of deer in the area. I think, one, to reduce density numbers, and two, to detect what the prevalency rate likely was in that area. And so a lot of them were employees. Some of them were private landowners, but basically they went, I believe it was even postseason, and harvested a ton of deer in these areas. Which
makes sense. And I assume they weren't aware of like the environmental carrying capacity at that point.
Correct. And I would assume that the deer populations were pretty thick. I mean, you're talking rich farm country bordering Iowa. And so again, think of this though as the landowner in the area. You have some of the best hunting in the Midwest, very comparable to Iowa. And now people come in and they're shooting 50 to 100 deer on some of these parcels to just mass reduction. And so
these are mainly state employees?
Yep, with the participation of private landowners.
Okay.
And I don't know how that all went down in terms of the discussion, but people in the area all of a sudden realize, like, holy cow, we just shot a ton of our deer in this area. Deer in an area that had been well managed for a long, long time. And in response to that, and us being in the market, we saw land prices crash. Nobody wanted to buy property there. Nobody wanted to lease property for hunting there.
What were the results of the test of testing those deer?
Pretty high prevalency of CWD in the area. And this was in the 2010, 11, 12 range, probably.
Yeah, so I mean, other than this environmental carrying capacity discussion, seems like that might have been the right decision. But there's no way to, it sounds like we don't know how to go in and cleanse.
So take yourself out of maybe the understanding of that. As soon as that happened, and I don't remember how many deer were killed. It was a lot. Nick, we'll look it up. But the basis was, okay, you killed all these deer that weren't dead because of CWD, right? This is where the lack of understanding and education comes in. Is basically you moved in, you killed a ton of deer in an area, very concentrated area. And for the outside hunter, and keep in mind, we then go through a very acute EHD outbreak where I could see all these deer die, and now it's like, well, you just killed all these appearing healthy deer, right? They don't look like they have chronic wasting disease. They look like healthy animals to test if they have it. Meanwhile, here in 2012, like I'm finding 50 to 100 deer dead on these properties because of EHD. So in hindsight, I wonder if we had not had that EHD outbreak, Bronson, if there would have been as much challenge to the methods of Missouri Department of Conservation and CWD. Because up until that point, we really hadn't seen an EHD outbreak.
I would think the results of that test alone should verify, say, hey, listen, we know that these tactics were under question, but what we found was whatever it was, 60, 70, 80% of these deer had, and so I mean, it's not good for the deer herd no matter how you look at it, and then to stack that EHD thing on top of it is a double whammy, but I don't know that you can point at the state and say it's their fault necessarily.
Well, look at an example
but from a perception standpoint, I do know what you're saying. You're saying that now that they're imposing mitigation efforts down the road, maybe that didn't help. I'm with you there.
So far, a long-term success and then some short-term comparisons. Let's look at the way some states have dealt with this. So, Jeremy, you may be familiar with the example from New York, which is like the shining example of if you can find it quick and eradicate those deer locally. And so the New York State Agency, of course, they had a couple positive deer. They went in locally, harvested a bunch. I don't remember the number. I don't know if it was 20 deer, 100 deer. I don't remember, don't know. But essentially, since then, they have not found CWD in that area. And so it does demonstrate the viability of that management option. If you can identify it early, get rid of those deer before it is spread to the extent where it becomes environmental, you're eliminating it before the chain reaction begins. Because once that chain reaction starts, it is very hard to suppress it. And let's look at, if we talk about the differences in the way state agencies in the U.S. have dealt with it, let's look at the way a different country dealt with it. Let's go to Norway, and let's talk about
let's take this thing international.
Let's go.
And with this critter above me right there, reindeer caribou, and the dynamics are different. And so those caribou herds have very distinct ranges, very little overlap with this herd and that herd. This mountain range or this valley. Well, they found, I don't remember, but it was 3 or 4 positives within that caribou, that reindeer herd. They went in and killed every one of them. They completely eliminated over 1,000. It may have been 1,200, 1,500. But they started with hunting, then sharpshooters, and I don't remember if it ended up with aerial gunning. They eliminated every single one of those because they understood that once this became endemic, environmental in that herd, ultimately they're all going to get it, they're all going to die, but then also it is going to be in that area. So let's go back to the example where we talked about from Colorado. And so even though all the animals are gone, if via intentional translocation or natural dispersal, the way they read that was this particular area is always going to have CWD.
Right.
So let's take drastic measures right now in the short term for hopefully a positive long-term response.
Yeah.
And I don't know how the people in that area responded, but I can fathom that it was very similar to what we're doing. How can you do this? This is crazy. You haven't proven enough. But they knew enough that we better nip this in the bud real quick, or we're going to be dealing with this for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, and I think that and again, this isn't a knock to necessarily the state agency side, but every state agency is handling this different in terms of communication to the public. I don't know if there's any areas specifically that are more prevalent than some of those ones in Wisconsin that were, bumping up to high 30s, 40% prevalency rates in some of the deer harvesting counties.
So what's happening over there? You mentioned that early on. What's happening in Wisconsin?
So, it's been in Wisconsin for, I don't know how long, 15 years?
Discovered about 2002, 2001, 2002.
So 20 years, that it's been in Wisconsin. And most of the time, and again, here's the thing. It's not funny to think about it, but if you look at it from a landscape level, right? It's just like Pennsylvania. For the longest time, there was, quote, no CWD in Pennsylvania, right? That's not the case. It just wasn't found yet, right? It was here. It was literally over the border in Maryland and West Virginia. Like, it was here. It's just through the testing. And keep in mind, at some of these starts, we were harvesting 600,000 deer, or 500,000 deer, but we were only testing 5,000 deer. So, you're trying, and it's because it costs money, right? It takes resources to do this testing. It's not possible to test every deer. So you test a proportion of the deer being harvested. So if you harvested 500,000 deer, right, and 495,000 were not tested, but only 5,000 were, odds are there was a positive test. It just wasn't sampled.
Sure.
So when you think about Wisconsin now being 20 years, which is crazy, geographically in Wisconsin, it was fairly isolated to certain counties, right? And so other counties were, quote, unaffected, no CWD there. If you look at it where it is now, it is in the western counties along the river for Wisconsin, which is where like your Buffalo County, Wisconsin is. I mean, the mecca of deer hunting in Wisconsin. And so now, again, to what we've talked about in these proactive measures, right? The DNR basically says, okay, now that we know it's there, here's the disease management area. We're going to buffer these counties, and we're going to implement a structure that's going to harvest basically a shitload of deer in these areas, which I don't know if they've actually done the sharpshooter thing. I know that's come across. It sounds like a very, very liberal bag limits, like very liberal bag limits.
Yep.
Mainly so that they can get enough animals in to do sample testing to understand the prevalency rate. Because now that they've found one, now they've got to figure out what the prevalency rate in that area is. My guess is, like most of Wisconsin, it's probably going to be relatively high. But think about in an area that has been managed. I mean, Buffalo County and that surrounding area has been like, a pivotal piece of quality deer management and large bucks and everything. Now you're basically going to come in and just crush that.
I mean, if it's been relatively high and they've had it for 20 years and the average life expectancy is whatever, 1 or 2 years with CWD, wouldn't they be seeing like whatever percentage this testing shows, wouldn't they see that same percentage of die-off like every year?
Yeah, but how do you find all the dead deer?
Just I don't know, shed hunting, walking.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
But they're not congregated. So think like with the HD, you can find them adjacent to water, and they're in large numbers. But what if every single year you've got 5% that are dying?
Yeah, well, that obviously wouldn't be noticeable, but that's also not a high percentage.
Well, even though if the prevalency rate is 40%, that doesn't mean that every year 40% are going to die. That just means 40% have it. I would assume.
And within 2 years, they'll be dead.
We don't know.
We don't?
So far, yeah, everyone that's been studied, to my knowledge, is up to 2 years, and they're dead. And I think that's a good segue too. And what is true? This is very much true, but it can be difficult to understand. Is that whether you're denying CWD or you don't like the management of CWD, is deer are dying of all these other things. Like Jeremy, I think you used the example of I harvested this deer and it looked healthy.
Yeah.
But it had CWD. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. But the next year you may not have seen that buck in the population because the disease manifested itself.
Right.
Our very first deer in Mississippi, in Issaquah County, was a hunter observed this really, really sick deer. If I remember correctly, he saw it die. I mean, it's stumbling along. But when they first did the necropsy of the deer, the specific cause of death was pneumonia. And that happens with a lot of these deer.
Sure.
Car collision,
Sure.
when you start getting holes in your brain, deer behave very differently. Hunter harvest can be greater. And so
They wander in
the
front
way
of
to
my
think
car when
of
they're
it is
perfectly intact.
CWD facilitates all these other
Right.
causes
Sure.
of mortality. And a great example is pneumonia. When you're, same thing with people in the hospital
Sure.
with all these other diseases. But what really, hate
What
to say
kills
it, what
them?
was the coup de grace
Yeah,
that
what really
was
killed
pneumonia?
them? Yeah.
Yeah, but what facilitated pneumonia? Well, in this case, it was CWD.
Yep.
Are there other diseases that are 100% fatal? I like HIV is the only one that I think comes to, like, AIDS is 100% fatal, right?
I
To
think
human
so.
beings.
Yes.
Like, they can mitigate it and they
Yeah.
can prolong your life, but ultimately,
Well, but I also think, like, from an HIV standpoint, you don't necessarily die from HIV. You usually die from
Same deal.
something else.
Yep.
Yeah,
Right.
pneumia, whatever.
Liver failure.
Liver failure.
Things
but
like
even
that.
cancer in some cases is curable, right? Like, they can.
Sure.
Well, you know what is 100% fatal, Jared, with humans is the human form of CWD,
Okay.
Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease.
Yeah.
What is it?
Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease.
Okay.
CJD is the acronym for it. And humans get this. Humans get it just like probably most other vertebrates. And it just hurts me, and it sucks. And if you live long enough, you may know someone. It's a very rare disease. But when you are diagnosed with that, it is essentially hospice.
Interesting.
There is no recovery. And to me, that's one thing I always come back to, of like, why can't we find a solution for CWD? Why can't we find a solution for CJD with
You're right.
humans?
Well, in humans, is it transmissible the same way that it is with deer?
No.
No.
It it is very much like the mad cow disease, with humans. When you look back at how this was discovered with humans, it was with cannibals in New Guinea.
Yeah.
And so part of their celebratory lifestyle in terms of honoring the fallen, and, this is just one of those cultural things. We can't comprehend this, but some humans do this.
Mm-hmm.
One way they would celebrate the passing of someone is they would consume the tissue. Some of that tissue being the brain tissue of someone that died.
Mm-hmm.
And so researchers started noticing, it's like, this Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is, I don't know the stats, so I'm making up a number here. It's 1 out of 100,000 people in, let's say, Europe and North America. But holy smokes, when we get to New Guinea, it's 1 out of every 100 or something. Like, something
Sure.
is very different down here. And they noticed that humans were consuming the prions the same way in Europe cows were consuming the prions. That's how it was.
Yeah.
And once they stopped that, they broke the disease cycle.
Yeah.
I think that the interesting point there is the fact that a lot of people, and again, just obviously not picking on you here, but just like you said, like, well, what do you mean they can't? Like, you just walk around, you just see the deer dead, and
well, at a high die-off rate. I mean,
which is why
I gotta
EHD
assume
is so apparent.
I gotta assume if 40-50% of your deer are dying off every year.
But it's not. It's spread, isolated.
Then it'd be tougher.
Yeah, or I mean, think of, especially right now in the wintertime, think of the number of deer, like Bronson said, you see hit by a car, or the number of deer you do find dead in the winter, and I'm like, tough winter on these deer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that deer could have died from CWD. I don't have the testing tools here to figure it out. I just assume it died from, or it got shot and it didn't. How many deer do you find, deadhead? And you're just like, well, it must got shot and, he just didn't make it.
Does that information you think exists? Do you think, like, has there been surveys of people in different states that are like, on average, like, first of all, do you walk a good portion of your property every year after the season? Like, do you shed hunt? Do you whatever?
Mm-hmm.
What's the average number of dead deer that you find per, square acre type of view? Because I think in my mind, we do walk a better part of
Sounds like a good research project.
Our property. And I have in my mind an idea of like how many deer I'm going to find.
Sure.
And some years I'm like, and that's where we have found some, what I think are EHD
Sure.
deer, and then there's others that I perceive are neighbors. Got an arrow in one. Sometimes I have proof. There's a crossbow bolt still in it.
Mm-hmm. And again, per the EHD, we usually
they get hit by
find,
cars.
Hardly ever rubbed out, like super sharp on the bases. Type. Like there's certain indicators there.
You would think that there's a demographic of people that have a general knowledge of the amount of deer that are dying per square acre on their property, and whether it's increasing or decreasing or what it might be caused by.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's been any research like that, probably, because it's observational.
Yeah.
I'm not aware. I do know that when researchers, and I'm going to be really interested when the study is finally published, but Wisconsin, I don't know if it's a combination of the University of in conjunction with the State Wildlife Agency, but they've done a really good job of capturing deer every year, and doing it in Arkansas as well right now, but capturing those deer, putting a GPS collar or some type of mortality sensor, and then doing a test on the deer at capture. And so they are able to then track a year or 2 years later is what was the fate of the deer that did not have CWD, and what was the fate of the deer that did. And the mortality curves are so very different.
Sure.
And so some preliminary data I saw was that, if you didn't have CWD at capture, about 80% of them lived. And so that just essentially means normal deer.
Right.
Is that some of them die from harvest, some of them die from predation, hit by a car. But those that did have CWD at the time of capture, even though they may not have died from the clinical form, when it came to be 12 months, 18 months later, 70% of them are dead.
Wow.
For all the same reasons, they just died at a much greater rate, meaning CWD facilitated their demise.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, that's that Arkansas.
We gotta get these deer taking saunas.
Yeah.
I heard that helps with all-cause mortality.
Yeah. That Arkansas area had a super high prevalency rate as well, didn't it?
Right. I think when they detected over 20.
Yeah.
Yeah. And probably well over 30 over most of the area.
So
in West Tennessee, just north of us, which is most likely
Memphis.
The spillover that's coming into Mississippi at some of those sites, it's 50%.
So, I mean, this is where it kind of goes off into a different offshoot from just a hunting standpoint. And we've dealt with this hunting in other states is, most of this spread of CWD is because of us, of hunters, in that we are shooting a deer, again, per our knowledge or per our vision and observation, looks healthy, looks fine, is contagious with CWD. We take it home, we cut it up, we throw it in the scrap pile, we throw it over the hill, we do whatever with it. And now we have essentially brought this disease into the area.
How does that spread it, though? Because it's getting into the environment and then...
Getting into the environment. So you're bringing the brain tissues...
Coyotes eat it, they poop, it gets into the grass, just deer eat it type of deal?
That's the thought.
But Jeremy, you just identified something again. My personal opinion, I think that's where the breakthroughs are going to come, is that is a viable mechanism you just described. But to my knowledge, we don't know if that represents...
We haven't proved anything.
A single transmission has caused that. Is that responsible for 2%? But what we do know, live animal to live animal.
Right.
And so translocating, meaning moving deer from point A to point B. And if at point A you had some diseased animals and you brought them into this area that didn't, you're guaranteed to have transmission 100% from that perspective.
Which is where the deer farming industry becomes extremely, spotlighted, basically, is that deer to deer movement. And honestly, and I'm sure, people listening to this know several of them. There's been a lot of people in the hunting community who have been accused of moving deer around or releasing deer or wanting to release deer to improve genetics. And this is the reason you can't do it, right? This is it right here, is that, when you take that and you move those animals and you put them into the wild, you are moving with it all of the other baggage that comes with that. The HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Hoyt Archery.
Dude, where would we be without our Hoyt bows?
Probably shooting crossbows.
or a Matthews,
One and the same. But in all seriousness, we love being Hoyt guys because you stand out. When you're in this room full of other people that shoot these other types of bows, I feel like the Hoyt guys just stick out.
Dude, it's just a legit bow. I mean, especially that carbon riser, man. I mean, I know that they've got several other aluminum lines as well, but for me, I'm shooting that RX5 in the carbon model. They've since come out with the RX7, and I can't tell you how much I love being a Hoyt guy amongst a sea full of Matthews guys. So we're out there, I think, proving them wrong, shooting 80 pounds and killing stuff.
Hey, man, if you want to get serious, get Hoyt.
So beyond the current mitigation efforts, which sounds like just shooting as many infected deer as possible, and I guess that's the main, just trying to slow the curve and removal. What kind of like testing or beyond that, I'm sure there's money and funding being put into trying to figure out how to get at least one deer to survive it so that it can be replicated and or cleanse the environments that are contaminated. Like what's being done there?
Yeah, well, there's funds going to research. As you can imagine, all the things that we're talking about and, what are the solutions? And, research can be really, really inefficient. Mm-hmm. You try a lot of things, trial and error. This shows promise, this doesn't, and you hopefully over time find the way that's most effective and most efficient. Other things state agencies are being done, like Jeremy referred to. First of all, there's carcass. Mm-hmm. And so if you're in a CWD management zone, you don't want to move the carcass from that zone. Of course, in terms of live animal transportation or translocation, that's usually eliminated. And then probably the single most, at least in the South, the single most controversial that really gets people angry is supplemental feeding and or baiting.
Yeah.
And the logic to me, I'm a dork, I'm an academic, so it just makes perfect sense to me. But I'm also I'm real enough to know, there's going to be a ripple effect to tick people off. Is that we just talked about over and over again, where are prions concentrated the most? In saliva. And so now you're in a CWD management zone where at some level, 1%, 30%, 50% of those animals have the disease. And now we're drawing them in to these different points on the landscape and eating after one another. Mm-hmm. And so that there's just a whole bunch of intuitive common sense that is a responsible thing to do in a CWD management zone is to eliminate that. Mm-hmm. And then someone could push back and go, well, are you going to eliminate it by doing that? No, you're not. But hopefully you're going to slow it down to some degree.
I don't want to get off track with that, but I do want to ask, what do you think about, you mentioned scrapes earlier. I'm curious in terms of transmissibility or the amount of saliva that's put down. Like, you're not going to stop deer from scraping, that's just a natural.
Exactly. You're not going to stop deer from scraping. You're not going to stop fawns from, getting milk from their mother. You're not going to stop bucks from grooming each other in bachelor groups. But if you remember something I said earlier, to me, that's where the breakthrough is going to come.
Sure.
Is within the life cycle of a deer. What are these 1 or 2 points where transmission occurs the most? And then can we do anything at all to disrupt that? Mm. So everything we just spoke about in terms of scraping, mothers feeding their fawns, bucks grooming, we can't do anything about that. Yeah. If you have deer, you're going to have that behavior.
Yeah.
But one thing we can do that really can tick a lot of people off is discourage or eliminating baiting and feeding.
Well, because immediately they're going to say, well, then you better stop doing food plots because that's going to congregate them. And then they're going to be like, well, food plots are the same as a farmer planting. So what, he can't plant his crops now. And it's that domino effect. And obviously it's not. When we talk about the broad-based level of a feeder or a corn pile versus a half acre or even a quarter acre food plot, the amount of dispersal across that plot in terms of feeding versus here's a definitive pile or feeder to do that stuff. We talked about this for Ohio. Ohio's had baiting legal for a long time. And I think that the only way that they would ever ban baiting in that state would be because of CWD. If CWD became prevalent statewide, that would be the only time they would put a ban on baiting, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So
That's right. That's right. And just, humans, once that becomes a common, your hunters, once that's accepted and a majority of them are doing it, yeah, you're not going to stop it.
right.
I don't think you're going to proactively go in and say, hey, we haven't found CWD, but we're just going to go ahead and remove that, activity.
Or enforce it. How are you going to enforce that from happening too? But again, I think that what people have to realize is that these, cautionary measures, right, are being done for a reason. And I think that people don't. They literally think that the state is just telling them it's another regulation of telling me what I can and can't do on my property. That's the exact words that somebody probably
Well, no, I agree, but that's there's a reason that faith's been lost in the past. Because there are some pieces of legislation that have been put through, in our opinion, like to the crossbow one and stuff. I don't think that was
sure.
I lost some faith on that one for sure.
And it's because it's a public resource, right? It's not your deer. Right. It's not their deer. It's not my deer. It's a public resource. And so we have to entrust in them to make the decision based on the resource. But I mean, again, managing the resources is fairly easy. Managing the stakeholders of that resource is not.
That is not. Yeah. And another thing that's difficult sometimes, and this is just my opinion, my thoughts and opinions do not represent my employer.
Sure.
They are of my own.
That's your disclaimer. Okay, we got it.
Yeah. State wildlife agencies, state fish and wildlife agencies, they really take it on the chin.
Sure.
From the public. They take all the ire at all. They are mad at the state DNR for this.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to realize your state DNR, they don't just, hey, here's this regulation and so shall it be done. It doesn't work like that.
Mm-hmm.
It goes through your commission, your legislators. And so the state wildlife agency makes a recommendation, and then something comes out on the other side, which may or may not be what they recommended. Mm-hmm. But no one seems to remember that there's two other parts of that.
Yeah.
Of before it becomes law or regulation, and you blame
the
state
issue.
DNR.
That's the issue, and I mean we've called it out before, because I do think that there's some realizations or recommendations coming from the agency that probably are not in the best interest of at least some of the stakeholders that are funding the licenses, but from a legislation political aspect of things, for sure not correct. Because they're not looking at the resource. They're looking at their constituents or who they need to have an influence on or whatever else, which is where the rumors of, the BS around State Farm and Progressive paying millions of dollars to the DNR to reduce deer numbers so there's less deer vehicle collisions and no. But I mean, if you look at politics and what it is today, sure as hell could believe it.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
It doesn't.
What a hard job, too.
No, 100% doesn't.
You don't think?
No.
Why not?
Do I think that the insurance companies are paying the game commission for that?
You don't think they've proposed it?
I don't know.
It would surprise me if they haven't.
I don't think that they've done it. The game commission. I don't think they're receiving funds from that.
Well, to Bronson's point, I don't think the game commission would be the ones to accept or authorize it. You know what I mean? It would go to the legislators who ultimately
from a lobbyist side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seems like I guess I don't know at that level, because I acknowledge that hunters are not the only parties affected by whitetail deer.
Correct.
So it makes sense that there's inputs from other places, but
which is why in our state, Sunday hunting is such a big hot button issue right now, because farmers, churchgoers, whoever do not want hunting on Sundays. And yet the majority of hunters might say, yeah, we're in favor of it. But that won't be the final say so, because it goes through the legislation to get that approved. Not if it was up to the game commission, it'd be done.
Yeah.
Done already. but it's not because they're not the final say-so on it. The state legislation is, which is an interesting topic.
Who our state legislation is in the hospital for chronic depression. You see that?
Well, yeah, well, that's U.S.
What's his name?
Fetterman.
Yeah, the guy that we just elected as our senator is in the hospitalized for like a month for chronic depression.
Yeah.
The guy also had a stroke like 8 weeks ago. When we were in the hospital the other day.
Who's better than Mehmet Oz, apparently.
Margie and Chuck still have their sense of humor about them.
Yeah.
My father-in-law had a stroke here, a mild one, fairly recently, and she's like, imagine running for senator right now. You know, he's like,
yeah, good win.
Wouldn't do it.
Yeah, could do it. So Bronson, I think that one of the things that people are going to be, when they're listening to this, like, okay, well, like, it's doom and gloom, right? I mean, everything that we've talked about here is like, basically, if I get it, I have it, and the only ways that I'm going to maybe get rid of it is to kill all the deer, and then in turn, it's still going to be in the environment. And I bet there's equally as many people saying, well, what about all these things I hear, like the live tonsil testing and, you know, vaccinations for CWD at the deer farming level? Because, I mean, there are plenty of rumors out there about these other tactics coming into play that, you know, essentially are CWD saviors.
Well, I guess I'll start with the last and then back up. There may be solutions at the deer farm level that may have no application for the wild. And Jeremy, it's like when you're going through school doing what we do, you learn all about contraceptives.
Mm-hmm.
It's really easy to control, you know, bucks and does and their reproduction, their offspring when they're confined.
Sure.
And when they can all be treated.
Yep.
That goes out the window with like all of these studies where they've tried to have a contraceptive for in a city, in a park, in a suburb, because if you don't treat every single buck or you don't treat every single doe, the system doesn't work. So
right.
There may be solutions that work at the deer farm level that I suspect aren't going to have near the application with free ranging. Doom and gloom. It is depressing, mildly depressing when you think about it. But we did, I referred to earlier, a series on our YouTube channel where we have these animated, narrated little videos explaining the disease. We also, hopefully by the time this airs, we're going to have 2 or 3 videos that we call real life landowner experiences. And these are all people, at least in Mississippi and Tennessee, that are in these zones dealing with the disease. And none of them are scientists. We do have some veterinarians, so they understand the biology and ecology of the disease, but they all just talk about what they have dealt with, what they have seen the last decade, things they have noticed. And we also, it's like we did not plan this at all, but this gentleman, I think, just had the sound bite about CWD. And he's dealing with it. He's on a place where the land that they hunt, they have noticed a decline. They still have deer, obviously, they still have deer, but the population is certainly not as robust as it has been in the past. And he equates hunting and deer management to a garden and a gardener, and says if you love to garden, there is always going to be some of the fruit or vegetables that you produce that are not going to go to your table. You're going to lose some. That is just the process. And it's going to be the same way on your property with CWD. But if you enjoy deer biology, deer management, hunting, we are still going to have a population where you can engage and still enjoy the things that you enjoy. It just might be that the same number of deer that you to see from the stand, or harvest the same number of deer that you would later consume, it may be less, but there is still very much a deer resource that you can enjoy.
Yeah. Well, and I
think that's the bright point out of this.
And I think a lot of people who maybe, again, aren't processing what the DNR is telling them, or looking at it in a much more negative light, think that that won't be the case, right? That these mass sharpshooting events or calling events is usually what you see, plus liberalized tags.
When coupled with like an EHD event, it could be tough.
Could be very detrimental on the herd. And let's be honest, like let's not sugarcoat it. The places like northern Missouri, northeast Missouri, where this happened, where this is now going to happen in the western part of Wisconsin, probably will never be the same.
Maybe so.
You know, not saying that they won't have any deer, right? Or
just because they're starting from less.
Yeah, and I mean, I will say this though. I've talked to probably 6 or 7 guys who hunt that northeast corner of Missouri that, 5 years ago, I wouldn't have leased a property there to hunt. I mean, it was in bad shape. They're killing giant bucks again in that area. And part of it is probably that at the time that CWD and EHD hit, there probably were too many deer to begin with, right? So the deer that have made it through have more resources. The amount of hunting pressure that's probably been let off of that area because people are like, oh, I don't want to hunt there. There's CWD or there's no deer or whatever, has now allowed bucks to reach higher or greater age classes. And so they are killing. I mean, somebody showed me a picture of it, like a 235 that they killed, and they're like, "Yeah, my buddy killed a 195 typical." And this, so I mean, it's not saying that it's going to demolish the resource. It's a fact that if you do nothing, that resource will be demolished. It's 100% fatal. If you do nothing and just let it go, at some point, maybe not next year, maybe not 5 years from now, but at some point, that resource will be gone. There will be no deer.
The question, I think, is how quickly does it spread? Because it's like how quickly does it go from 5% of the herd to like 50% of the herd or more, or 100% of the herd ultimately,
And I think that's where some of this management and mitigation is that, everybody that understands this knows that, for example, if you take baiting and feeding out of the equation, that's not saving the herd from CWD.
Sure. Slows it.
But Jared, to your point, it may slow it down. Yeah. It may give you another 5 to 10 years before the manifestation is noticeable and tangible.
Yeah. And the other silver lining, or I think the hopeful statement that we could make, is just because we don't know how to cure or how to prevent CWD right now doesn't mean that we won't at some point.
Exactly right.
Yeah. So as long as
I love Doug Duran, his statement he made, it was so perfect in one little sentence. I think he really encapsulated the whole thought of it. And I'm probably going to butcher it, but it's something like follow the science or let science catch up. Do what you're supposed to do management wise and let science catch up. I think that's it. Now let's also think about your kids. Let's think about your grandkids, and let's think about a hands-off. We didn't do anything, and what they are going to inherit in terms of a deer resource. And I mean, I can just see them going, why didn't you do anything?
Well, and I mean, that I think is, and listen, we're probably all guilty of it as hunters of, withholding trail camera pictures or whatever. There's a selfishness around hunting. And I'm not saying it's an unhealthy thing, but it's just, those who are very passionate about it have a selfishness around hunting. This is one of those cases where that could be very critical to which way this ends up going. If you're truly thinking like, well, that's crazy, I don't give a shit what happens 20 years from now. I mean, I get that, but that's a selfish way of thinking, because, we have a responsibility as hunters to leave this thing better than we found it. And if we do nothing, it sure as hell isn't going to be that way. And so, as much as you might be irritated or agitated or angry about, a liberalization of bag limits and, your hard work being kind of taken back a few steps, look forward and know that if you didn't do that or that doesn't happen, then the next generation who enjoys this as much as you have maybe won't have that opportunity.
Well, I think you have to believe in the prescription. Like, somebody who feels like, whatever it is, like a mass harvest or it is going to help with the CWD, issue, then more people are going to be willing to get on board. Whereas if it's just kind of like a shotgun approach people are like, well, that's not going to do anything. Like, I'm not,
Well, I think that's where
they're going to be far less
communication-
likely to get on board.
Yeah, that's where, again, from a variation of these DNRs, the communication is so critical. Because if they just step in, which is what I think a lot of people, and again, maybe a lot of this is just assumed or interpreted, this is what it's going to be like, but it sure sounds like the DNR just kind of slapped, hey, this is what we're going to do in Western Wisconsin now with this being found. And everybody's like, what the hell? What do you mean? Like, why? Like, what do we think's going to, and there just wasn't any communication. It was just like, here's what it is.
And they should be surprised. It's like, I've had, CWD for 20 years now. Like,
sure.
Hey, we're finally doing something about this now.
Just you choose to pay attention to the things that, are affecting you today.
The baiting thing seems like a no-brainer. Well, the arguments for, so anything that's going to congregate deer in a...
Sure.
I would exclude food plots. Anything smaller than a quarter acre is probably fair game, but like your mineral sites for sure, a baiting site for sure. So whether it's a feeder or just dumping some sort of a thing. The arguments for that is that there's like a lot of money that goes into those things. Farmers in some areas are probably making a good portion of their income from selling corn to hunters.
Sure.
Maybe even more than they're selling to whoever. And also for think about, you go to Rural King or
just the industry in general.
Yeah.
Which is
the stores, the shelves are lined with, your whatever, your sugar beet crush or your attractants, and all that essentially goes away.
Yeah. That it does.
Along with, some hunters will go with that too. You get rid of baiting and people don't know how to hunt and not overbait.
Yeah, it makes it easier for sure.
So they're just like, well, I'm not going to, how am I supposed to see a deer if I don't have bait, And so there's some fall off there as well. But other than that, I mean, honestly, those two things seem fairly minuscule on the grand scheme of, do you want deer 20 years from now or not?
Yeah, but I think that that's a mentality standpoint, because there will be plenty of people that, if you said, hey, you can't bait here because of this, a lot of us would say, yeah, no problem. There are a lot of people where it's just like, make me.
Sure.
I mean,
well, and that's where I think the first of all, the awareness of the severity of like the potential consequences of something like CWD, and also a belief in the prescription are so valuable.
I mean, there's still plenty of people.
If I don't believe CWD is going to hurt anything, then why would
there's plenty of people and of stature in this industry that believe CWD is bullshit, and they'll tell you it.
Okay, so who are they and why? How can you say that it's bullshit?
I mean, I won't put anybody under the bus.
Is it? I mean, what about it is potentially?
I mean, they just believe that CWD is another, government tactic to,
kill deer,
force control on to yourself and your property and everything else.
Okay. Do we have confirmed deaths from CWD? What can we? Okay. Go ahead, Bronson.
Oh yeah, we have confirmed deaths. There's no doubt about that.
Okay.
Absolutely. And one of the most misguided things I hear is this notion of, this is another scare tactic from your state wildlife agency to discourage you from hunting. And if you have any insight into how the budgets work for your state fish and wildlife agency, it is so dependent on selling a license.
Yeah.
They're never going to do anything to discourage you from hunting or fishing, because they need that license revenue to sustain and build the management system.
Yeah, if anything, we're more critical of them having too much opportunity to recruit people to where it's like, slow it down a little bit. So they're not going to discourage you from buying a license with this as a scare tactic.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I wouldn't just throw it right off the table. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me to know that there are, whatever you call them, activists or groups of people that would pay more than we can pay in license fees to get rid of hunting. That wouldn't surprise me.
That's certainly possible, but to date, no non-hunting organization that I'm aware of has stepped up like hunters have stepped up. I mean, it is license sales. It is the money that we're spending is steering the ship.
Well,
And
your
nobody's even close.
Your insurance company rumor or folklore would be one potential example. And so that obviously wouldn't go through the game commission because the game commission wants to stay employed. They, advocate for hunting and for wildlife. But if an insurance agency or all of them together came to you and said, hey, what are they paying you in hunting license? Yeah, we'll beat that. We'll beat you by 50%, and they go straight to the legislators. Then I could see there being some.
Yeah, but how do you manage the resource then? I mean, because hunters are the tool to manage the resource.
Yeah, I don't know.
Period.
Yep.
I mean, now on a private level,
CWD, you just kill them all. Kill them all with CWD. I guess that's
on a
The
private,
insurance company would want to sell more licenses.
right?
The insurance company would want to liberalize the bag limit if their goal is to decrease the population and decrease car collisions.
Yeah, but what if we just introduce CWD to kill them all?
Well, yeah, but then what happens?
What
happens when that jumps to humans at some point?
Sounds like it already has, but it's not transmissible. It's just a different disease.
Different disease.
Kind of just not of the scare tactic. I mean, if we go back to that Colorado study, I mean, they're pretty sure that the scrapies was the original foundation that then potentially species jumped to CWD, correct?
To my knowledge, I don't think they have ruled out that as a possibility, as some type of mutation that occurred there. But again, I am way over my pay grade talking about that.
Yeah. So I mean, because that was always the fear, especially when you talk about consuming the venison from an infected deer or anything, is that, if you go back into that was late 60s that stuff was happening.
Mm-hmm. Late 60s.
That there was a potential species jump from sheep to deer. Again, not confirmed, not 100% positive. And obviously seeing it on a mad cow side, right, to potentially humans. Like, they're always, I mean, if anything, that is the big centralized discussion is, yes, the herd management and the effects of CWD on the herd and how that's going to affect the resource long term is super critical. Now, pull us 10% of hunters away from the population. The other 90% of the country would be scared shitless if there was a thought of CWD jumping to humans. At that case, you want to talk about eradication of deer.
Yeah.
If 90% of America got onto the bandwagon that said, hey, we don't even want to take the chance that CWD is going to jump to humans, kill them all.
Mm-hmm.
Now, where do we stand as the 10% of hunters trying to protect that resource?
Sure.
That's not a place we want to be.
No.
Because I don't think they would give two shits about us. That's where your dollars from outside agencies and organizations and things like that would come in.
Sure.
And you would be snowball run over.
Yeah, SOL.
Yes. Real quick.
Shit out of luck, Nick.
Yeah. So when, and again, when we talk about the unification of hunters and stuff, that is the stuff. Like, sure, there are groups that are always against hunters, right? But to the point of the insurance company, people need a method of controlling these wildlife populations. Hunters are that means of doing so. Now, if the CWD jump to humans would become more of a reality or a scare tactic, then when the 90% of the population decides, hey, we don't really like deer that much anyways, just kill them all, now we're in deep shit.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And that's where, no matter what you are as a united front, good luck.
Sure.
Well,
when you put it that way, it makes sense to try to employ as many of these like mitigation efforts as possible.
Exactly.
Like, and other than some of the small, attractant industries and stuff that I mentioned, and maybe the urine. And
yeah, I mean, there have been impacts. The urine industry has taken a huge impact. A lot of these groups that have been making synthetics have greatly benefited from it. A lot of the smaller manufacturers who function more around the natural urine base have probably taken extreme hits, on that front.
Yeah. And so I don't mean to like belittle any of those companies by saying it's a relatively small thing, but like in the grand scheme of management of the resource, like it could go away.
Sure.
It could go away.
Yeah. But very quickly.
Huh.
Yeah. And I think that's where, and I don't know. So Bronson, I mean, the question would be, whose job is it to educate the public on this stuff? I mean, from a state by state basis, you would think it would be the state wildlife agencies. And I'm not saying that they're not, But it sure seems like if you spend 5 minutes looking at the chatter about CWD online, quickly you can realize most hunters have no clue about the severity of this disease.
Well, that's in my opinion, that gets really complicated because we have so many sources of information. And again, I'll say it again, let's go back to COVID or something like that. YouTube, I am one of these people that I think YouTube is wonderful. I think the opportunity for education and good information far outweighs the negativity. But all you have to have is a really good YouTube channel that is saying just the opposite of, that is a detractor from. And if that is your perspective, a detractor, I don't believe it. And now you start reinforcing and feeding. But in my opinion, I guess I am biased in terms of who's supposed to be educating. Well, that is your land grant university plays a role. Your state fish and wildlife agency plays a role. And I would think even the hunting industry should be playing a role. I think we should have a real united front with CWD, but there's always going to be someone on social media and YouTube that is, quote, an expert. And if they're really good with words, if they're really good at entertaining, and they get a big following, and then that's all this person heard on YouTube because of the way the algorithm keeps feeding the rabbit hole you're going down, so that they don't get the academic perspective or the state wildlife agency perspective. They just hear this very vocal person with a big reputation and a big name talking about how CWD is a joke and is BS.
Yeah, and I mean, not that he'll ever listen to this. Nugent's one of them. Nugent will be one of the first ones to tell you that CWD is bullshit.
Yeah, and why? What's his argument?
He's Ted.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, Ted.
Well, because I'm open to lots of things are bullshit. So.
He's also part of the deer farming community, right? Which I'm not saying that all deer farmers are bad or negligent to this. In fact, they're the most affected of the industries here. Right? I mean, the deer farming community, especially in a state like Pennsylvania, I think at one time, I don't know if we're still there, we had 800 deer farms in the state of Pennsylvania.
What would be the incentive for somebody to not believe in CWD? Why? I would
management.
think
yeah.
What
the repercussions of management. It's going to have to change your behavior, and that may even change your livelihood. It may change your income distribution and revenue streams. Is the things that are enforced to hopefully limit the disease affect you personally.
Right.
And so this is a way of lashing out.
Yeah.
And again, as human beings, this is independent of CWD, as human beings, we are very averse to long-term outcomes. We always are biased towards what happens to me today, what happens to me tomorrow versus 20 years from now. A fellow won a Nobel Prize in economics for the psychological term, the nudge, meaning we have to do things for people that are in their best interests because they don't have the wisdom or foresight to do it for themselves. So let me repeat, we have to force people to do things that are in their best interest because they're only thinking about today and tomorrow and not 2 decades from now. The great example is forcing people. You have to go in, with most companies or university or government, whatever, you have to go in and implement some work on your part to opt out of retirement. The default is when you come work for us, we are setting you up for retirement. And you have to go to a lot of trouble with the paperwork to opt out. That is a great example of this because most people, if you said, hey, Jeremy, we're going to be real proactive about this. I promise you 25 years from now, this is in your best financial interest.
Right.
Take a little bit of your check right now and invest it. People will not do it.
No.
I want right now. And so you have to not cheat them into it, but you have to do a little bit of smoke and mirrors where you got to go to work to opt out of that.
Yeah, or incentivize them to match what they put in and things like that. Yeah.
Right. So take that context, and now let's talk about short-term CWD management, and you can't do what you used to do.
Yeah.
And now there's a little bit of change, and people don't like that.
Well, it's tough because you have to trust, the institution or the agency that's like, trying to push you down in that route. You're using the COVID example earlier, and so use the vaccinations of like mandatory. You'd look at that and say, hey, the U.S. government is saying this, or even whatever,
New York,
the health, whatever Fauci's in charge of there, they're basically saying, in all of your best interests, this is mandatory, and so, and a lot of people went for that and but ultimately it came out that like, hey, maybe that was an overstep, or it didn't do, what they were claiming initially that it would do. And so like you see a big loss of trust in agencies, and that's just, one example that's happened over.
Yeah. And that's probably the grandest example, at least in most people's forefront mindset.
And so for good reason, a lot of people don't trust, those organizations, anymore. And I don't think that, whoever's doing the studies on CWD necessarily, there's any reason not to trust them. But on a grand scheme, I think smart people anyways, have a tendency to question things.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and again, it comes back, I think.
It is the people who don't question things, though, that are taking the bait of, like a Nugent or whatever, like hook, line, and sinker. They're like, yeah.
Sure. Well, and I think
this is BS.
I think it's gotten to the point for a lot of these things, too, where, in COVID definitely was one of that where it was like, you're on lockdown, you can't go anywhere, right? To the point where it's like, in the flip side of a deer hunting standpoint, hey, we're going to come in and we're going to shoot all these deer on your property. Yeah. And it's like, whoa, what do you mean? Like, it's just, I understand the deer is not mine. Now,
and look at the difference though. Like in the beginning of COVID, everybody was terrified.
Sure.
Everybody was like, yeah, no, we're home. We're all going to die.
Yeah.
I don't think that the rate of being alarmed is nearly to that level with CWD. Frankly, it's
no.
I don't really think of it
again because I also think it's not acute.
Yeah,
that's I think the biggest issue that people have right now, because I read before we did this, I read a whole bunch of things on it from just like a generic hunting forum standpoint, videos, comments. Everybody's looking at it as like, man, I've never even seen a dead deer from CWD. The only time I see dead deer is because somebody shot them and then they got tested and they're positive, right? This is the number one thing. Nobody questions that on EHD because it's usually acute most of these.
Dead. Yeah.
There they are. They died from it. It's right there. That freaks me out. How do we stop that, right? So from the CWD standpoint, because it's not acute, because it's a chronic form, and because most of the time they are dying, but just from something else, people can't buy into that, right? Yeah. They don't follow the suit that you're really telling me that if I didn't shoot that buck at 3 years old, by 5, he would be dead because of CWD. And maybe some of the people who ask questions are smart enough to look at the research, like you mentioned, Bronson, and it shows that 70+% of his deer would have died in 2 years, but 15% of that was hunter harvest. 10% of that was, natural mortality. He's like, okay, that deer got shot at 5. Would he have made it to 6? Like, those are the questions that we've become trained to ask ourselves after being in a lot of these positions. But, without that definitive, here they are, and they died from it. And at that point, it's too late.
Yeah.
Right? If all of a sudden we start walking through the woods somewhere, to your point, we start walking through our farms, and it's like, there's a dead deer, there's a dead deer, there's a dead deer, there's a dead deer, and it's from CWD, we're screwed. Game over. There is no mitigation at that point.
Yeah.
So, unlike EHD, where you see that, and you're like, oh, shit, this is bad, boom, we get our first hard freeze, and it eases up, everything's done, we don't have to worry about it anymore. With CWD, we start walking through the woods and finding dead deer that subsequently test positive for CWD, you're screwed. Game's over already. There is no, at that point, you could say, oh shit, I'm sorry, I should have did, too late.
Yeah.
Game over. But that's, and I feel like people listening to this too are waiting for that. They're waiting to go out there and trip over a deer, and then there's another one, and they're like, what the hell's this? And it's like, well, we've been telling you that CWD is 50+% prevalent. Now they're all dying. And you're like, okay, well, what do we do about it? Too late, dude. But the alternative to that is, hey, we have to come in and do these mitigation activities, which means mass harvest of deer in your area. Well, hell no, you're not doing that shit. You can't have it both ways.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it doesn't seem like that's really being proposed in a lot. I mean, northern Missouri and southwestern
It's
Wisconsin
everywhere.
are about the only places I've heard of any
No,
mitigation
it's
stuff.
anywhere that there is a significant density of positive test, there is mitigation efforts happening.
So Coshocton,
Pennsylvania,
which we mentioned earlier, all they did. So there's a Coshocton County in Ohio. They had a bout of CWD there, and they eliminated baiting, I think, temporarily.
Mm-hmm.
And to my knowledge, that's all that was done.
Yeah, but that could have been an isolated event, right? So if you had one deer that got out from a pen or whatever, or was brought in, something like that could have been an isolated event. They could have tested deer, prevalency rate was low or non-existent, almost a false alarm, right? If you go north of Columbus, there's 4 or 5 counties that baiting is illegal because they have a prevalency rate that is now being detected every year amongst harvested deer. Same with Pennsylvania, same with Arkansas, same with Mississippi, Tennessee. And here's what you have to remember is you may have a 5 or 6 county disease management area, but it's a very isolated area that they're really doing these strong mitigation events on, right? I mean, they are targeting almost the center of the bullseye. There are undoubtedly effects that come off of that center of the bullseye, right, indirectly. But those mitigation effects are very localized for a specific reason, right? So even if you get looped into a disease management area, the first thing, you can't be like, oh my God, they're going to come in and kill all these deer. They're not. It's very isolated in where they're doing this because they're targeting the most likely areas of high concentration and prevalence rates. But if you look at it across I mean, I know Wyoming was doing it. Nebraska had it. I don't know if Kansas has it now. I think they do. They do. So, I mean, and who was it? North Carolina was like the 30th.
Most recently, North Carolina.
30th state now. So there's 30 states that have it. Here's the other one we don't talk about. The Canadian provinces are loaded with it. Loaded.
Well, we haven't really covered any other species either. Like, are there a bunch of other species that have
elk?
Elk have CWD?
Yes.
Mule deer.
Mule deer. All similar in terms of like mortality rate and transmissibility?
Yeah.
Whitetails appear to get a prevalence rate higher than all the other species. So bad for us, good for them. But we don't see these 30 to 50%, for example, in elk.
Yep.
And is that a difference with their physiology? Is it their life history? I don't know if anybody knows.
Is it a matter of
Well,
time?
and the original study in Colorado, those were mule deer, right?
Yes, I believe so.
So, you know, and I would assume same with like a lot of the declines. Because when we were doing our mule deer hunts, one of the ones that came up was Wyoming. And Wyoming mule deer populations in certain part of that state are just off the cliff right now. And I assume, at least the short study I read was talking about the lack thereof of mitigation efforts in those areas to where now CWD is causing the natural decline, right? Because keep in mind, when you have mitigation efforts, you are going to have a decline in population. That's the whole point. That mitigation, though, of active removal is going to be a lot different than a natural decline in populations, right? Meaning, if we do an active removal, that herd has the ability to bounce back, right? Because we went in and we manually removed. We tried to slow the spread. There's going to be more resources for the individuals left, just like we were talking about Northeast Missouri. Take it from the other end, if I do nothing, the natural decline, when you start on that natural decline, I don't know if you can stop that skid.
Yeah, it's difficult once you reach that threshold of 30 plus, certainly 50 plus %. Yeah. You don't have any choices. You don't have any management options left.
Yeah.
So the best thing to do is to be proactive. And again, just coming back to this is just really difficult to forecast. We're enacting these these restrictions, this management, and we think about what does it mean for my short term, and that's what we focus on. But what you really need to think about is, and this gets away from us and it starts getting into your kids.
Yeah.
What does the resource look like a decade or two later? And is what we did today helping have a more robust population 20 years down the road?
I don't think there's probably
that's really what it's all about.
Any greater challenge, though, and I mean, I'll put myself in it with kids to say, hey, you have to look past the next 5 years to look forward to the next 20. Shit, I may not even be on this earth in 20 years, you know?
Yeah.
I'm saying that openly, as that's a huge challenge to all of us as hunters. And that's where the biggest friction point is because you've got a lot of people who say, shit, 20 years from now, I'm not even going to be alive. So what do I care? Well, you've got to care for the next person who gets to enjoy the resource as much as you did, you know? And how do you ask somebody not to be selfish?
Right.
You know, it's a choice.
It's hard to ask a human not to behave like a human.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I want to think that more people would care than, you know, than I think more people would care. I think it has more to do with the lack of understanding or you know, just maybe not understanding the severity of it. I know that I guess I don't know where I'm supposed to be getting like the warnings from and stuff. And yeah, I see CWD from time to time, but like I'm kind of in that demographic of like, I don't. Nobody's contacting me directly
until
about it.
Until it's in your backyard.
Right.
Why?
Right.
Why care about it? And really,
well, it's not that I don't care. It's just
there's nothing you can do if it's not in your backyard.
Well, and it's not just that there's nothing that I can't do. It's just like it's almost not even like a It's like I've heard of it, but it's not there. It's not affecting anybody I know personally that I know. You know.
Yeah. When I think that's it is when it becomes. Yeah. To the point that it affects you, you have to be ready to make the right decision.
Yeah.
You know, and that right decision is probably going to go completely against everything you've been trying to do for the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. Well, and when it comes to, I mean, obviously the baiting thing, like tomorrow, it'd be cool if it was gone.
But what if they said, hey, we got to come in here and shoot 70% of the deer on your farm?
Right. I mean, I would hate that. Obviously, I would prefer to address it with things like getting rid of baiting and stuff like that first. But if it came down to like, hey, it's 70% of your deer herd today or none 10 years from now, then I mean, if somebody can show me the data, you know, I'd be on board for that.
Well, and where it comes in for a lot of us, and obviously you are too, in terms of the big landowner side, is a lot of people have spent tens of hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in cases of managing deer.
Yeah.
Now, you know, no antler restrictions. Kill every deer, every buck you see, especially. I mean, we talk about a prevalence rate. The one thing we didn't mention is the buck population is usually the higher prevalence rates. And especially when you talk about those 1.5-year-old bucks that are dispersing, you know, across landscapes. I mean, those are the ones that, you know, those are the ones that need to take a bullet in terms of the mitigation effort.
It's too bad that you can't do a targeted prescription to say, hey, like, only shoot CWD deer. Like, there's no way to know until you shoot it.
That's it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the bummer.
That'd be a game changer. If something behaviorally, you could identify the ones that had the disease, this gets a lot more simple. Yeah.
Yeah.
But to date, there's just no way to know.
And that's where, I mean, and you're going to see it kick back. Because there is, it's not just the management aspect. There's a financial aspect that will happen. I was talking to somebody the other day. They were like, hey, do you think, I think it's like, I don't know, it's like Tremolo, Buffalo County. I don't know. There's 4 or 5 counties there in western Wisconsin that, you know, historically have been $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 an acre farms. And my kind of reaction was, well, that's going to be what Northeast Missouri was doing, from 5,000 to 7,000 acres to 2,500 or less in value. And they're like, we can't take those kind of hits. I don't know what to tell you. That's just, I mean, because those farms produce decent farmland, but they're selling for recreational farms, for hunting. And so when the recreational value is no longer what it was, the values of those farms will, I mean, land is about as recession-proof as possible, except for something like this. At that level, the land value will decrease, because who's going to buy it for $7,000 an acre when, you know, you're essentially slaughtering deer across it in hopes that you slow it down enough to mitigate the effort.
Yeah, I mean, dude, industries, you know, and markets, they fluctuate. You know, you see a lot of like a similar prescription would be, you know, like federal mortgage rate hikes. You know, that would be an example of like a mass harvest to try to, you know, it's kind of the same thing, you know, and that's obviously devastating the real estate market in some parts of the country. It happens, you know, and there's ebb and flow, and there's, you know, you hate to see it, but that's life.
Yeah. Well, and again, they do that so that it outweighs inflation, hopefully, in the long term, to balance the economy back out.
Yeah.
But you're looking at tomorrow paying, well, now eggs have come down, but whatever, $8 for a dozen eggs, you know?
Yeah. So basically, if there's any prospect of CWD in your area, sell now or buckle down for the next 15, 20 years.
Yeah. I mean, that's what it's going to come down to. So
or hope for a remedy.
I would encourage people to look at, God, I don't know all of them. Macon County's one. I don't remember the other ones, but in that Northeast Missouri, go back and start looking at some of the deer that they're harvesting from there. Even if you want to check, Boone and Crockett or Pope and Young record book, they are killing some substantial deer in that area, which, 10 years ago, nobody wanted to touch with a 10-foot pole. And again, I've always said it, and try to look at the glass half full. You reduce the amount of deer in that area, there will be more ample resources and space for the deer that are left behind. You reduce the hunting pressure in tandem with that, and now you're getting deer to an older age class. All of those mechanisms are going to likely produce better quality deer in the long run.
There's just fewer of them. But that's a density-dependent process.
That's it.
And so you reduce the number of deer. There's more food relative to the remaining deer. And the ones that live to 3+, 5+, they've got more food resources. So, but that's a great example, Jeremy, of all is not lost.
Right.
It's just the way that it had been is going to be a little bit different.
Yeah.
There's steering the ship just a little bit, but all is not lost.
Yeah.
Back to, you can still enjoy the garden, the fruit from the garden. You just may not get as much fruit.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, not that I ever want to see it in that state in a great prevalency rate, but I do believe that we talk about this all the time. Like, Iowa obviously is doing it right as a mecca of the wildlife state. Kansas, I think, has seen a turn downward because of some of the way that the land and leases have happened with out-of-state hunting and allocations of tags. If Ohio would ever have to mandatory ban baiting because of chronic wasting disease, I believe 100% that Ohio will be one of the greatest whitetail states that has ever existed. 100%.
It already is. I mean,
But think of the level it would take it to.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying, again, that's trading that out for what would be a greater evil in chronic wasting disease, right? And not knowing what those effects would be on the herd. But if that was a repercussion, an indirect effect was the elimination of baiting in the state of Ohio because of that, you will have to deal with CWD. But I also believe that the quality of animals that would come out of that state, surprisingly, would be more substantial than they are now.
You would think. But because right now it is one of the best trophy, whitetail deer hunting states, despite some of the most effective, efficient, liberal,
harvest,
3 and 4 year old buck harvesting methods out there. Bronson, we probably haven't talked about it specifically, but we've covered time and time again the corn pile, cell camera, straight wall cartridge rifle, 100-yard away scenario. It's like it's 100% success rate. It's like, how could you not kill? And at the same time, you have, the long-term effects of, QDM positively, people's mindsets that, they're willing to pass a 2-year-old buck, maybe in some cases a 3-year-old buck in Ohio. So people are shooting bigger deer in general because they're willing to pass. But, a ton of them still are getting
shot at 3 and 4
shot because of that, which,
it's hunting.
It is, yeah.
It's a public resource.
Not to go all the way down that.
No. But I think that is, again, the one thing that I don't know, and I would be curious, and I don't know if we've done any measurements on it, going back to fewer deer, density-dependent relationship there, Bronson, is, one of the biggest unknown factors we have in our effects on deer, in particular bucks, is the social aspect. Right, the spatial and social aspect. Obviously, we know that if there's an overpopulation of deer in an area, then likely that's going to have a negative impact on that deer's ability to express its full potential. But so I would assume, again, to the point of lesser deer in an area, more resources to that deer, more space to that deer, the potential of that deer to reach that maximum is probably very high.
Yeah, it would be greater.
Mhm.
Absolutely. If there's less competition,
Mhm.
yeah, and more relative food supply, yeah, it has greater potential to get larger.
I think the one interesting factor would be, and I don't know how you would do it at a a wild situation, but obviously, as if a deer contracts CWD over time, as that disease begins to progress, it's going to have a wear and tear on that body. You see a lot of people shoot, a deer that appears to be relatively healthy. I know there was, Eric Mitchell killed a 3-year-old buck in Wisconsin that was like 220 pounds field dressed. I mean, you would have no idea or never knew that deer was infected. My interest would be around, obviously, as that disease progresses, that deer's body weight and antler size is probably going to also decrease because of those, it's got to focus those resources elsewhere. And I would assume that most people don't think of that in that aspect.
Yeah, if there was a way to see that deer a year or 2 years later,
yes,
you would predict that a year later it would have either just maintained or regressed.
Right.
2 years later, it's dead.
Yeah.
But you're still in a situation there where even getting to 2 or 3 years old and still getting to 130, 140, or 150 in terms of inches of antler, it's still really, really good.
Right.
And I think that's what's difficult for a lot of people to reconcile, is that things are still good. It's just for the people that we want to get those bucks to 4 or 5 or 6.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about likelihood and probability. You're just decreasing the likelihood that 30% or up to 50% of those bucks are going to live to maturity.
Yeah.
And depending on your harvest regime and your expectations, you may not notice that because, hey, on average, the way we hunt, if we get deer to 3, that's all we want.
Sure.
Everything's fine.
Yeah, you don't even pay attention.
If you're in South Texas, Jeremy,
mm-hmm.
and you want to get those bucks to 7, you want to get those bucks to 8, and now you've got a 50% prevalence rate.
Yeah.
Trouble. Your bucks just aren't going to make it there. They're going to be dropping off at 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
Instead of 5, 6, 7.
The HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Stealth Cam.
Dude, where would we be without our cell cams?
I would definitely be divorced at this point.
Yeah, I hear that.
I mean, the fact is I spent more time checking cameras than I actually did hunting prior to cell cameras. Now, at least, my wife can enjoy me being in the comfort of my own home, buried in my phone, checking those pictures.
Yeah, 100%. And dude, when it comes to trail cameras and definitely cell cameras, reliability is, I think, the number one thing that we're looking for. Stealth Cam just has a long reputation of reliable cameras, and ultimately that is the most important thing to us. They have to work.
In terms of reliability, there's not a better camera on the market than Stealth Cam, whether you're talking about the Fusion X, the Reactor, or the DS4K Transmit. And most of them are under $200.
Stealthcam.com. Check them out.
I think one thing, I'm going to make one last twist here, Bronson, we'll let you go, but mainly because I know that you're in this world now. And Jared, we talked about it offline briefly this morning, is around, management, but also the consulting atmosphere of things, and talking about, habitat consultants and hunting consultants. We could go down a huge rabbit hole, but I won't. But mainly I want to say, because everything that we discussed today, whether it's CWD related or just hunting and management and expectation related, revolves around understanding the data and the numbers on your herd locally. Unless you're doing definitive observation data, harvest data, and a trail camera survey, you don't know. You have no idea what you're dealing with on your property. And so I think, just for people listening to this, if you haven't conducted a trail camera survey especially, or if you're not collecting your harvest data, you need to start. Because you could plant the best food plots, the best screening, the best switchgrass, the best TSI work. And ultimately, if you're not measuring any of that from the end result, which is the deer side, besides saying, well, I see more deer, or I think I see bigger deer, you're missing a huge opportunity to truly understand the benefits or possibly the detriments that are being caused on a property.
There's a few indicators, right? Particularly browse lines, whether they're
from an overpopulation standpoint.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, at least from a availability of food standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yep.
whether it's with exclosure cages in a food plot or just in the
Mhm.
woods. You know, that's
Absolutely.
one way to observe an overpopulation.
Yep. But from a quality of the herd or a sex ratio, you know, people will talk about, especially where Bronson's at in the South, you know, the lack thereof of rutting activity during certain times of what would apparent be the rut, you know, called the drip rut down there, you know, is because of major imbalances in the buck to doe ratio. Too many does per the amount of bucks that are there. You can get some of that through observation data from being in a stand, but you know, ultimately passive trail camera data to then do an analysis is going to be the best way to get that done.
Measurable.
Same with talking about, I mean, there's a lot of people who are probably in a CWD zone, whether by now they've shut us off and cussed us out, or if they're still listening, I don't know. But understanding, is your deer herd actually declining? Because there's a lot of times that I've been out on a property in a comparison and a visual hunting standpoint being, man, I just am not seeing the deer that I've seen in the past. Well, maybe that's because there's more acorns in the woods and they're not in the food plots or whatever it is. You know, to truly understand that, you need to have a standard measurement situation, which is usually via a trail camera survey conducted about the same time every year and looking at those trends. You know, not exactly are those always definitive numbers, but year to year, those trends over trends become very telling about your property. If you're in a CWD zone and you feel that your deer herd is declining and you're not doing a trail camera survey, I don't think you really know what's happening.
Yeah, that's something independent of CWD, but we always recommend is if you really want to have your finger on the pulse of your deer population, and you know, it might be relative to, is my management working? Are we over harvesting, etc. Is we recommend harvest data, and that is looking at the condition of your deer, lactation rates, etc. Every one of these gives you a piece of the puzzle. And so harvest data tells you one thing. Indirectly, are my deer in good condition? If they're not, why is that? Is it the environment? Is it because of mass this year? Is it because of drought? Or is it because of overpopulation? We then always recommend observation data. And 2 or 3 of those, what you saw on the stand, is irrelevant. It's no good. But over a hunted population where you literally have 30, 40, 100 observation events over time, that tells you, yeah, we're seeing less deer than we normally see. We're seeing less mature bucks than we normally see. And then you could have something like a camera survey, even more objective, pre-season, before you have human disturbance, which may be affecting deer, making themselves visible in daylight hours. When you have all 3 of those year after year, you really, from a biological and management standpoint, you have all you need. That really tells you the direction and trajectory of your deer herd. So always recommend that.
And I think that's one that, you know, I've been critical of at the state level, because I mean, you see a lot of estimates being thrown out of deer herds, numbers wise, population wise in these states. But, you know, we've talked to the Pennsylvania Game Commission, we've talked to Michigan DNR, I've talked to Wisconsin DNR. Like, everybody does their estimates of population different. You know, most of them are a model base, right? Because we're not taking a census. We're not taking like a complete census of every deer that's out there.
Most of them are harvest data, right?
Usually harvest data.
I have a big problem with. I don't. All that means to me is we killed more deer. Doesn't mean that there are more.
They're
deer.
just placing it in a model for the projection of if that model remains constant and the same amount of people every year turn in cards, which is not 100% or whatever the report is, then it model projects. And it's not to be...
Yeah, but to your point about, you know, some other stuff is like our harvest methods are constantly changing. You know,
Yes.
So in 1 year, I know we beat it into a pulp, but like the crossbow thing is, you know, you say, okay, 1 year we harvested this many deer, and then you introduce a new method, you know, whatever it is, or you elongate the season, whatever you introduce Sunday hunting, and then the next year it's like we harvested this many. That's a completely skewed, I think, you know, a population metric.
Sure.
That's just how many deer you killed. You just killed more deer.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, your model is based off of years of data, right? Data in generates the model for result output.
Yeah. You have multiple variables at that point.
You do.
Yeah, and the exact number is not as important. It's the trend.
Trends.
And so none of these estimates are going to yield you. We harvested 700,583. You know, it's not that. Is it 10% less this year or 10% greater this year? So you just keep those methods constant to see, are we trending up or trending down, or are we maintaining?
Yep.
And Jared, a lot of those people, like what we utilize here now, is a phone survey.
Yep.
And so it's calling people that hunted, and then year after year, you know, how many days did you hunt? What did you see? What did you harvest? And so you've got to factor in the number of days that they hunted, because the harvest may be the same, but you hunted twice as long. And so a good analyst and a good model will tease apart the effort. We call it man days or hunter effort.
Yes. And I'm sure that's tough to collect. You know, people are busy.
Yeah.
Yeah. You got to call a lot of people before you get someone that answers the phone.
Yeah. I think people are realizing the importance of that information,
Sure.
you know, and you can't, you know, it would be hypocritical of us to, you know, speak poorly of any agency or method that's being prescribed without giving them as much information as we can. So we always try to make a point in the states that we hunt to answer those surveys.
It's just like if you bitched about who got elected and you didn't vote.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
You know, and you say, oh, my one vote didn't matter. And it's like, well, maybe it did.
Yeah.
So, well, we appreciate it again, man. Thanks for dropping some knowledge on us, Bronson, and elaborating on a hot button.
You've become a staple for us and for our podcast. We learn, we learn something every time. And so we super appreciate you coming on.
Anytime.
So Bronson, just for people listening, because I'm sure a lot of people may be head spinning, still have questions. The MSU Deer Lab YouTube channel,
and we'll put a link to it in our
so
bio.
that's where you've got these new CWD based videos. And are you going to continue to release video content on that topic?
Yeah, we've released most of it already. So in terms of the what is the disease and what we do about it, we have released those. Those are live. And within the next week or two, we've got about 3 videos that we call CWD experiences, you know, from landowners, from hunters, and it's just literally conversations of what they've experienced. So it's nothing from us in terms of our information. It's here's someone dealing with it. What do they say? And we're just making that live.
And then have you guys had any discussions on the podcast about it as well?
We have regarding CWD in general.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've had several. There's been some with me and Steve, some one with William McKinley, our deer coordinator. Brian Richards, for example, we've had him on. We've talked about the Wisconsin experience and the adjacent Illinois experience and their management and the consequences. So you can find some of those podcasts. We go into pretty good detail about the disease. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll make sure we drop some links in the description for people who want to keep learning about that. And again, we appreciate you coming on, and we'll pull you back in for something again, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Enjoyed it. We'll talk soon.
All right. Thanks, sir.
All right. Thanks, Bronson.
All right. See you guys.
Awesome.
Here we go.
And tons of information. I would definitely watch those videos on the Mississippi State Deer Lab YouTube channel. And honestly, the best information you're going to find, whether it's easy to consume or not, is going to be from your state agency, because it's going to be the most relevant to what you're dealing with. Like if you're in Wisconsin, don't necessarily look at what Missouri or Illinois is doing. Look at what Wisconsin's prescribing. And there's usually town hall meetings and things like that, to the point where we said, like, if you don't vote, don't bitch about who won. You know, if you don't go to one of these meetings and voice your concern, don't bitch about what they do. Well, that's what it comes down to.
I mean, definitely weird to hear that there's like almost conspiracy theories about CWD.
Lots.
Yeah, like to know that there's people out there who...
well, if comments on this video, that'll be conspiracy theories or...
Sure. Well, and...
whatever.
Not that, you know, you are a biologist, like, but not that you and I have...
I have no idea about... Like, I've never had to deal with CWD.
Not that you and I have put hands on a confirmed case of, like, this deer died of CWD, but, like, you know, so... You know, I think we trust Bronson's research. Like, you know,
Well, I didn't know it was like a 2-year death sentence. I had no idea.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of this is
I thought it could have been like
new to me
5 years or something. I had no idea.
But it's just odd that, you know, I think we've come to trust Bronson as giving us the information as the science
Yeah, there's nothing to
tells
gain
it.
for him out of it.
Right. He's I think relatively unbiased, or as much as possible. To know that there's people out there, prominent people, like refuting it, it just begs the question, why? It's curious. It would make me want to dig into like what some of their motives are, more than anything.
Yeah, and I think it's just selfishness. First off, I mean, because the research is there saying that this is an issue, when you refute it, you're selfish because you're telling people, don't worry about it. Don't do anything. This is stupid. We should do nothing. When this blows up 20 years from now, and you may be gone from the face of the earth, but your kids or grandkids are like, man, I remember the time my grandfather used to hunt deer. They were all over the place.
Yeah, and I don't think that that's any of them would want that. I think that
I don't know, man. I think you'd surprise yourself with some of these people and how self-centered they are.
Sure, yeah, maybe.
I mean, no different. And I mean, we all get bent out of shape about it. But I mean, there are people that will literally feud their neighbors to the point where they'd fight them because, they shot a deer and you didn't, or the deer and you didn't. And it's, yeah, I mean, all of us get upset about that. And I was like, damn it, man, I put so much effort into that thing. But I mean, most of those people are very self-centered to thinking of that was my deer. This is my deer. You shouldn't have shot it. My deer. And I mean, it's a hard thing because I know even in this podcast, you and I probably have got our caught saying like our deer or our buck or whatever. And it's just because like that's just how we think about it. It's a public resource.
Sure.
Right? I mean, that deer, unless it's in a high fence, that deer goes across boundaries and it's a public shared resource, which is why we get so pissy about maybe the abuse of the resource or the, exploitation of that resource or, when it comes to the mismanagement of the resource of it, because it's a limited shared resource. But I think that there are a lot of people that they're just selfish, man. They don't care. They give zero whatever about what the next generation's going to inherit.
Yeah, there's no doubt people are selfish, but I mean, they're just deer at the end of the day.
Well, and I mean, to the point
I get it. I mean, dude, I've put as much money as anybody, relatively, into these things, and you want it to work out, but I mean,
I mean, listen, if CWD pops up, just like EHD, if it comes and ruins the herd on your property, a property you've put so much time, effort, blood, sweat, and tears in, there's nobody's denying that is a fucking terrible thing, man. You do not want to have to experience that we don't wish that on anyone.
Yeah, detrimental.
But it happens. And then what you do and how you respond to that is really what's going to talk, future years about you as a landowner and a conservationist. And if you're just like, well, I'm not a conservationist, I'm a hunter. And it's like, well, yeah, there are quite a few of you guys out there. But a lot of us care about the resource. We don't want to see it go away. If hunting goes away for those guys, then they go and drink beer and watch football. Great. Have fun. Mm-hmm. We care about hunting and the resource, and we want to make sure that's healthy and that's sustainable. You do it as a hobby. We do it as a lifestyle. Very different. And that's fine. There's room for both of us in the sport to do it. But don't abuse the limited resource or mismanage the resource because you've got a plan B backup and you don't give a shit about it. This is what we encompass ourselves around. And I think that's an important thing when people are thinking about this is, and go talk to your state biologist, get involved with it, figure out before you jump to conclusions, figure out what the hell is happening in your area. We're not far from it. In fact, so we're in Fayette County, Somerset County is in disease management zone. I would assume in the next 3 years, Fayette County will also be in the disease management zone. Mm-hmm. Probably
meaning confirmed cases of CWD
in the county, and we'll be in a zone that now has probably no antler restrictions, higher doe bag limits, blah, 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 blah. It's inevitable, right? I would assume that the majority of the whitetail range in the next 10 years will likely have some sort of disease management implications on it. Not necessarily to those localized events where they're really doing mitigation activities, but some sort of regulation that says, hey, sorry, you can't feed, you can't use deer mineral, you can't use deer urine. you can't transport these deer, and you've got to check in the heads at this place or whatever. There'll be some sort of regulation on top of it. And this goes back to where these people are going to say, well, no more state regulation. The status, we're not doing. Like, you have to have regulatory authority here. If you do not, this is what happens. The disease spreads, the resource goes away, and then we have nothing.
Which, I mean, dude, none of this stuff is natural. Like, it almost seems like, you know, some sense of karma that, like, hey, you know, we took liberties with wildlife for so long to bait them with, like, to bring them across state line, like to transport them, like to do all these things that are like not natural to the deer herd. And like the consequence is, you know, you have this disease that's 100% fatal and highly transmissible now. It's like, you know, it kind of seems like, hey, maybe we shouldn't have done any of that from the beginning.
And listen, it's inevitable to a point, right? Because humans are humans. I mean, take a history lesson. The Europeans came to North America and the Indians got smallpox and they died because they were introduced to something that was not native to their environment, right? Same thing is here. You know, as this stuff happens and as these deer are moved into areas, they're introducing a disease that is not native to the area, and it's going to have a detrimental impact on it. The only way you stop that is you stop transportation of wildlife, right? Which in most cases is pretty regulated. It's just, how do you enforce it, right? And then the other thing is, as a community, us doing our part to help in this mitigation effort. Yeah, nobody wants to see a mass shoot of deer in their area, but again, you have to make a decision to trust, and that's a hard word, man, to trust in somebody that you maybe don't have a lot of faith in, and it being DNR or Game Commission or Department of Conservation, to do the right thing. So 5-7 years from now, you're in a very different position of healthier herd, mitigating the issue of CWD versus a downward plummet of the deer population that will never recover. And I think I challenge the state agencies to put that on their shoulders, to take the responsibility to educate, inform, and really kid glove essentially these landowners and hunters who are very passionate about the resource, to help them understand why you're doing what you're doing. Because just blanketing regulations over top of them and never really helping them understand why this is happening, meeting with them, talking with them, visiting them on their property. And I know this is all resource heavy, but they're never going to understand and they're never going to trust you. And that's just it. That's the bottom line. It's the reality of things. Everybody wants to point to somebody that, you know, this is the problem child, and they don't know what they're doing. And it tends to be the state agencies, but, you know, take that as a challenge to try to get out there and break that mold. And I don't know how you're doing it right now, but media is media at any point. And, you know, sometimes it takes in-person discussions to fix that.
Yeah.
You know, communicate, man. That's all you have to do is just communicate. Don't treat them like they're idiots. Talk to them like they're a fellow hunter that cares about the resource as much as you do, and explain it to them. And I think you'll see a lot bigger response than you think.
Touching.
All right. We will see you next week.
Later.
Take me